Yes, I guess we want you to come up
No,
here.
he told me.
You ready? You ready for me to go?
Okay. A little after 11 o'clock, I like to, one of my 4 rules for judges is to always start court on time because the judge can be late. So good morning and welcome to the Administrative Office of the Court's Black History Month celebration. Although this tradition started in February of 2020, this is only the second time we've been able to gather in person since the COVID forced us to go remote in 21 and 22. And although I attended the inaugural event as a member of the Supreme Court, this is the first time I've been invited to speak, having just taken the office of the new Chief Justice in January. And I'm honored for the opportunity and I'm grateful we can gather again in person here at AOC. Earlier this month, I spoke at the Black Legislative Caucus's Black History Month celebration at the Capitol. The theme for that event was Black History is American History, which reminded me of a time a little over 3 years ago when I was privileged to meet Congressman John Lewis from Atlanta. This was about 8 months before he died. As many of you are aware, Congressman Lewis was one of the big 6 of the civil rights movement, the others being James Farmer Jr., Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Philip Randolph, Roy Wilkins, and Whitney Young Jr. Congressman Lewis was very gracious to my son and me, giving us about 15 minutes of his very busy time. And I don't know about you, but when I'm in the presence of a great person, I become like a little kid, very awestruck. And we've all seen the horrifying videos of the start of the 1965 march from Selma to Montgomery, which was March 7th, 1965. It's also known as Bloody Sunday. A young John Lewis led the march coming across the Edmund Pettus Bridge. And I said to the congressman, you walked across that bridge knowing the Alabama state troopers were going to beat you. And he replied simply, someone had to do it. I asked myself, would I have walked with him across that bridge? And frankly, I don't know if I would have had the courage, but certainly that he and others did is a great testament to the righteousness of the cause. Congressman Lewis recognized the progress that's been made, stating, when people say nothing has changed, I say, walk in my shoes. We all recognize that we as a society have made great strides, but we still have a way to go, not only walking across the bridge, but to the land beyond. I'm pleased with the progress that the court system has made over the past few years to provide diversity trainings to judges, circuit court clerks, and employees in our statewide programs. And I look forward to leading the judicial branch as we continue to address racial, ethnic, and equity disparities. Thank you. So with that, I think we have Tremea Johnson from the Kentucky State Choir, I think, who's going to sing the Black National Anthem.
Lift every voice and sing till earth and heaven ring, ring with the harmonies of liberty. Let our rejoicing rise high as the listening skies. Let it resound loud as the rolling sea. Sing a song full of the faith that the dark past has taught us. Sing a song full of the hope that the present has brought us. Facing the rising sun of our new day begun, let us march on till victory is won. Stony the road we trod, To the chastening rod felt in the days when hope unborn had died. Yet with the steady beats of not our weary feet come to the place for which our fathers sighed. Oh, God of our years, God of our silent tears, thou who hast brought us thus far, thou who hast by thy might led us into light, keep us forever in thy path, we pray. Lest our feet stray from the places, our God, where we met thee. Lest our hearts, drunk with the wine of the world, we forget thee. Shadowed beneath thy hand, may we forever stand true to our God, true to our God, true to our God, true to our deity.
Wow. Tremaya, thank you so much. That was beautiful. That was powerful. Thank you. Thank you so much. And now at this moment in time, I would like to take a moment to introduce our keynote speaker of the day. Dr. Smith is a full professor of history at the University of Kentucky with more than 2 decades of experience. He began his career in academia in 1988 at the University of Memphis and began working at the University of Kentucky in 1997, where he took on a role as the director of the African American Studies and Research Program. He is the author, editor, or co-editor of 5 different books and has published more than 40 articles, essays, and book reviews in historical journals and encyclopedias. His efforts in co-editing the Kentucky African American Encyclopedia helped it earn the prestigious Kentucky Historical Society Publication Award in 2016. Over the years, he has served on a variety of different boards and committees. As of now, he currently serves on the Kentucky Historical Society Foundation Board and the Mary Todd Lincoln House Board of Directors. In June of 2020, he was appointed by the mayor of Lexington to serve as co-chair of the Commission for Racial Justice and Equality in Fayette County. He has won a number of awards, including the University of Kentucky's Inclusive Excellence Award and the University of Campbellfield's Racial Reconciliation Award. In 2019, he was inducted into the University of Kentucky College of Arts and Sciences Hall of Fame. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dr. Gerald L. Smith.
Good morning. Good morning. Thank you, Mr. Carrington, to Chief Justice Van Meter, to all the honorable justice and those in the court and everyone here. I am blessed to be here. Amen. What he did not share with you, first of all, is that I am really Gerald Smith. And I say that because if you look on the program, there's a picture of a man that has a black mustache and all black hair. And I took my mask off, and you see that guy's mustache is gray. But yeah, I am Gerald Smith, but I'm also a pastor as well. I pastor Pilgrim Baptist Church in Lexington, Kentucky. And, when you put the combination together of a pastor as well as a professor, it could be a long gathering. So, Mr. Carrington, how long do we have? Tell me. He said 30 minutes. All right. Y'all heard him, 30 minutes. We all right. I heard you, Chief Justice. We all right, 30 minutes. Okay. So again, thank you for the privilege and opportunity to come. I have elected not to accept too many speaking engagements at this point. I'm actually working on another book and pastoring and everything as well, but it was extremely an honor, and I'm very humbled to be here. My intention was to really focus more on my latest book that was just published last month, Slavery and Freedom in the Bluegrass State, Revisiting My Old Kentucky Home, and the display there, and there's some flyers. I have been researching the Kentucky African-American experience actually for more than 40 years, going back to my undergraduate days at the University of Kentucky. And so in light of your theme, Paving the Way, Celebrating Black History by Honoring Kentucky's Pioneers in the Judiciary, I elected to focus my talk today, but I'm titling Digging Up the Past in Search of Black History in Kentucky. Digging Up the Past in Search of Black History in Kentucky. Kentucky has a number of different myths, and among those, there's a Welsh prince going back to 1170 AD was going to have a colony here. That's a myth, somewhere around the Falls of Ohio. Another myth was simply that there were silver mines in eastern Kentucky, long-standing myth going back to the 1760s. Another myth about the city of Paducah, named for Chief Paducah. Paducah, there was a Native American tribe, the Paducahs, but there was no one named Chief Paducah. But yet and still, there's a statue and everything down there proclaiming that. Another myth involving Daniel Boone. My interest in Kentucky history goes back to my days when I was a child and watched Daniel Boone back in the 1960s, late 1960s. Fess Parker played this character, Daniel Boone, in the theme song, and you can go online and listen to it. I teach a course on the history of Kentucky, as well as another course on the Kentucky African-American experience. One of the things I do in that course is that I sing that song for the students. I'm not going to do that right now. You can go online and listen to the song. But I became interested in Daniel Boone because of that television program that came on, and of course that he is this noted frontiersman and pioneer man in Kentucky, was the one, of course, who helped cut through the Wilderness Trail, the founder of the settlement of Boonesboro in 1775, and just his exploits in terms of fighting Native Americans and, just sort of this heroic kind of figure. But there are also myths surrounding Daniel Boone. Some of them involve, of course, where he carved his initials into a tree or on the barrel of a gun. But the other one, the most noted myth about Boone, is regarding where he is buried. And of course, the long-standing story is that, for those who don't know, Boone actually died in Missouri in 1820. And he was buried there in 1820. In 1845, his body was moved, brought back to Kentucky and Frankfort before he was reburied. Plastic cast of his skull was made. It's at the Kentucky Historical Society. You can go see that. Around 1983, the state forensic anthropologist looked at the skull, examined it, and said that it looked more like that of an African-American, Africanoid skull. And so that became a big controversy, was where is Boone buried? Is he actually buried here in Frankfort? And some of you may have visited that grave before. And as a young kid, my fascination with Daniel Boone was I convinced my parents to take me to Frankfort so that I could go see where Daniel Boone was buried. And so as a little kid, I had no idea of knowing that there's a possibility that Boone is not buried there, but there is an enslaved person actually buried in that grave. Now, I'm not going to go into more detail about that, but of course, the mere fact that some might look at this as a sort of poetic justice, because the Boone family did own enslaved persons. When he died in 1820, and they went to bury him, there was already some remains next to his wife, Rebecca, who had died in 1815. They buried him at the foot of her grave. And so when his remains were removed in 1845 and brought back to Frankfort, because the people in Missouri did not want to surrender his remains, the argument was that, well, they actually kept the original bones in Missouri, and Kentucky got the bones of an enslaved person. The debate continued on till around 2010, when the Boone Society said, well, we have an official document now that we do have Boone's actual remains. Well, the question is still up in the air because no one is really focused on that plastic skull in terms of whether or not it was an enslaved person. Okay. Now, I say all of that because it kind of fits into my talk today in terms of digging up the past in search of Black history in Kentucky. And, for me, my interest in the Kentucky African-American experience, started with two famous Kentuckians. One was Daniel Boone, and the other was Abraham Lincoln. And growing up, the 5th, 6th grade and all of that, like many of you, I heard about these noted Kentuckians. When I got to college and I learned about African-American history, and I thought, wow, these are things that I was unaware of. And there is so much work that needs to be done about just learning the Kentucky African-American experience. And so here we are in 2023, and we still find ourselves in the midst of controversies and questions and trying to legitimize the research, the writing, the teaching of African-American history. Why is that the case? Why, after all of these years, after Black History Month, of course, became more concrete in history in 1976, after Carter G. Woodson founded African-American History Week in 1926, and now we're in 2023, and we're still trying to explain, well, why is Black history important? Why do we continue dealing with these sort of questions? And one of them is simply because we, as historians, continue to try to dig up the past, because much of the past, the African-American past, has either been ignored, erased, denied, or buried. And that's one of the things that I focus on in this new book, in the introduction of the new book, in terms of looking at Kentucky's history and how our history has been buried. And a part of that history that has been buried was the participation of someone, or the role of someone rather, who was with Daniel Boone by the name of Monk Estill. You see his image there. Monk Estill was the individual who taught Daniel Boone how to manufacture gunpowder. He was, of course, one who was with Boone at Boonesboro in the 1770s. He was one that was also involved in fighting Native Americans and protecting white settlers, even though he was enslaved himself. In order to find out about Monk Estill and others, he's just one who was a part of that frontier community, then it involves digging up the past. Now, stay with me. I'm speaking a little fast because I want to make sure that I stay within my 30-minute guideline. But if you know anything about Kentucky, you are familiar with this image right here. Does anybody know where that is? That's an image of. Well, has anybody ever visited Mammoth Cave? Okay, well, that's Mammoth Cave. That's the entrance into Mammoth Cave. Now, I've always been, as a child growing up, curious and loved to tour places, and Kentucky has some wonderful places to tour. And in my Kentucky African-American History course, I take my students to Mammoth Cave. I first visited Mammoth Cave in the early 1980s because I just wanted to go there. My wife, who was my girlfriend in college at the time, Teresa, I said, come on, let's go to Mammoth Cave. I like to go on these adventures. And so one Saturday, she and I and about 3 other friends, 3 other couples, we decided to go to Mammoth Cave. Well, the tour guide mentioned the name of an individual by the name of Stephen Bishop in passing. And it stuck with me. And so before you know it, while we're in the group on the tour, I left my girlfriend and I'm walking with the tour guide, asking him all kinds of questions because I was fascinated with who was this Stephen Bishop. Well, years later, and much research has been done on Bishop now, Stephen Bishop was a young enslaved teenager, about 17 years old. His owner, Franklin Gorin, purchased Mammoth Cave in 1838. And Stephen Bishop was the one who was the guide to the tour. So he's the adventurer, he's the explorer. He goes throughout the cave. When you go to Mammoth Cave and you cross the bottomless pit, you know, it was Stephen Bishop who was the first one to cross the bottomless pit. You know, when you look at Fat Man's Misery and Tall Man's Agony, I might have them mixed up, but if you've gone through that cave and you've had that experience, well, the first person to do that was Stephen Bishop. Now, I'm talking about digging up the past in search of Black history in Kentucky. Well, there were other enslaved individuals who were the early tour guides of Mammoth Cave, were well recognized by people who came from all over the United States to tour that cave. And they were being guided by African-American enslaved men. You know, they had a walking stick. You see the basket where they carried their lunch. They had a lantern. And of course, that were their tools in order to assist people, lead whites, that is, through Mammoth Cave. When you went to Mammoth Cave, you didn't go for 1 or 2 hours. I mean, it was 2 or 3 days when you went down to Mammoth Cave. It was an excursion. The Bransford family, 5 generations of Bransford family have been tour guides of Mammoth Cave. The last is my dear friend, Jerry Bransford. Jerry is still a guide at Mammoth Cave now. He's a 5th generation guide. Anytime I take my students, you know, I ask that Jerry be our guide because his family is so much a part of that history. And you may have seen Jerry in a number of different historical documentaries, but he talks about his family history at Mammoth Cave. And of course, those are the huts where, you know, the enslaved men who would bring those who were sick. And Dr. Cron was concerned about the fever that was hitting Kentucky and the cholera epidemic, especially, and believing that the cool temperatures in the cave could help relieve the cholera epidemic. It didn't. People died. Well, it was enslaved people that would carry them out of those huts and back on the surface. Now, there's one part of Mammoth Cave that a lot of tourists overlook, or actually unaware of. And so if you ever visit Mammoth Cave, you know, I invite you to ask to go to the old burial ground, the old guides burial ground, the old guides burial ground. Now, I've always been interested in cemeteries as well. And that's why you kind of see a theme running through here early on, is in terms of cemeteries. Daniel Boone Cemetery. Now we're at Mammoth Cave Cemetery, and this is the old burial ground. And here is Stephen Bishop's tombstone. You look at that tombstone carefully, you'll see the date of death is 1859. Well, digging deeper in search of Black history in Kentucky, the record reveals that Stephen Bishop actually died in 1857. So the inscription is wrong. The rest, in terms of him being the first guy to explore a Mammoth Cave and all, that's fine. But there's something else wrong with that tombstone that is very inaccurate. But it's there at the old guides burial ground. And what is wrong with that is that is actually a Civil War tombstone. Okay. When Stephen Bishop, the man who explored Mammoth Cave and discovered all of these great sites there, when he died, he was buried in an unmarked grave. Let's sink in for a second. He was buried in an unmarked grave. And not until the late 1870s that a millionaire from Pittsburgh was visiting, a white millionaire was visiting Mammoth Cave and actually met Stephen Bishop's wife. Her name was Charlotte, and discovered that Stephen Bishop did not have a tombstone. He said, I tell you what, I'm going to get him a tombstone. And 3 years later, He got him a tombstone. But the tombstone that he got was an unclaimed tombstone for a Civil War soldier. So that's why you see the swords on top of the tombstone, because Stephen Bishop dies in 1857. The Civil War doesn't begin until 1861. Talking about digging deep into Kentucky's Black history. Y'all still with me? Right. And so as a part of that project and other work that I've done, one of the perhaps more rewarding projects, but definitely one of the hardest projects had been working on the Kentucky African American Encyclopedia. This encyclopedia, and I know your theme is about paving the way for the pioneers and all. And so, early on and looking at, Black history and celebrating Black history, we focus on the first Black man, the first Black woman to do this, to do that, and so forth. And all of that is important, because that's how we start. I mean, that's how we address various stereotypes. I mean, that's how we reclaim and restore that history into its proper place. With the Kentucky African American Encyclopedia, what we did, myself, John Harden, as well as Karen McDaniel, we were the three general editors of the encyclopedia. There's about 1,100 entries in that volume. It's available. It came out in 2015. People, places, events, organizations, institutions. It is a door stopper, I might add, but it's full of photographs. It's something that I encourage everyone to get, especially for your children or grandchildren, others. It is a very informative volume. One in terms of that you're looking for basic information, the first to do this, the first to do that. And of course, there's a few individuals who paved the way that are included in that encyclopedia. For example, Sarah Helen McCurdy Fitz Butler, who was the first Black woman to earn a medical degree here in the state of Kentucky from Louisville National Medical College in 1892. That's Sarah Helen McCurdy Fitz Butler. And then, of course, there's Oliver Lewis, the first African-American to win the Kentucky Derby in 1875. Of course, there's Benjamin Spencer, who was the first African-American to get a teaching certificate in 1878 in Kentucky. The list goes on. Lydia Lewis, the first African-American woman to be crowned Miss Kentucky in 1973. So we could go on with the first to do this, the first to do that, right? But digging deep into Kentucky's Black history requires more than dealing with the first. When I teach Kentucky African-American history or Black history, whatever, I've got to go beyond that to understand, our history. And actually, I was given a talk, it was last week, and I focused on teaching, researching, and writing Black history in Kentucky. And then during the question and answer period, someone asked me, I think the moderator asked about what is, history. And one of the things that I shared there, I said, when you think about history, history means different things to different people at different times, at different places. History is constantly moving around. And I know that this, in terms of, what you do in your profession, facts are important. But when it comes to history, facts do not always make it their way into history. It's basically boils down to who is actually recording that history. And what I have learned and what we know is that how the African-American experience has not been recorded. All the facts have not been included. Somebody's got to dig those facts up. And because we have to dig up those facts, that means we have to work more with primary sources, with court records. We've got to work more with wills and deeds and city directories and newspapers. And you can't take everything for granted because you've got to dig deeper. Just what I showed you with that tombstone of Stephen Bishop. If we just looked at that and assumed, oh, he died in 1859. No, he really died in 1857. So stay with me. Boy, the time's going fast. I've got 9 minutes and I just got started. Okay. All right. So I'm not going to get very far at all. So I'm going to close it out with this story. And I'm going to leave time Okay, the Chief Justice said, keep going. Yay, somebody said, no. Don't, don't get him started. We'll be here all day. Well, anyway, while working on the Kentucky African American Encyclopedia, one of the things we did was we traveled all over the state of Kentucky and gave so many presentations about the work we were doing and just trying to find out more about what was happening in different counties. Gave a talk in Winchester, Kentucky, interviewed people, met people there, all the way to Hickman, Kentucky. I'll talk about in just a moment. Hazard, the northern part of the state, everywhere. Well, on one particular occasion, it was actually in 2008, May 13th, 2008. I was given a talk at Bardstown, Kentucky, at the public library, and got there early. The talk was like at 6 o'clock. Got there real early, and I told a research assistant of mine, I said, hey, I want to visit my old Kentucky home. I've never been there before. I said, I've heard the song many times. I said, let's go by. He said, okay, Doc, we'll go by. So we go to my old Kentucky home. So this is just an old signage of old Kentucky home. How many people have ever been there before in Bardstown, visited my old Kentucky home? Okay, so, quick story that it was founded in 1795 by Judge John Rowan, who was a judge himself, who was a lawyer, who was a U.S. senator, and who was an enslaver. He owned slaves. He was a cousin of Stephen Foster. Here's a picture of Federal Hill. This is what we recognize as it's a state park, as my old Kentucky home. And so constructed in 1795. Stephen Collins Foster, there's a picture. He's the author of a number of different plantation melodies. As soon as you pay your fee to visit the home, there's a statue there. There is a plaque beneath the statue, a little bit about him, composer of Kentucky State Song and so forth. And no doubt many of you have sang the song before, very much aware of the words, but the words, of course, are first published in 1853. Been very offensive, some of the darkies are gay. It was a part of the plantation melodies that he wrote, Masters in the Cold, Cold Ground, Old Black Joe. These are some of those songs. Okay. So when we visited the home there, and the docent had no idea that I was a historian, I was just a visitor, wanted to learn more about my old Kentucky home. I didn't let them know anything. And so the docent began to show us around the grounds and then point out, this is where Stephen Collins Foster wrote the lyrics to my old Kentucky home. And I kept asking the question, I said, so where did the slaves sleep? And where did they live? And what about the nanny? Where did she stay? And when I would say slaves, she would say servants. And every time I said slaves, she said servants. And so because as I shared with you, had always been curious and fascinated about cemeteries, I said, so where were the enslaved people who worked here? Where are they buried? Because as soon as you enter the grounds, there is the family cemetery there at Bardstown. And so she said, they're buried in the back. And I said, okay. And so my student and I are walking towards the enslaved cemetery. And shortly before this photograph was taken, there was a gentleman there who was looking for his golf ball. He was in the middle of the fences there, and he's searching because, the park is next door to a golf range, a golf course. And so immediately I'm infuriated. It's like, wow, I cannot believe, that people are looking for their golf balls, and this is where enslaved people are buried, and how insulting to our history, and we've got to do something about this. There's no walking trail to indicate that this is where these people are buried. The song, that's a story by itself, but now we're talking about public memory and how people are seeing the past, because this is 2 years away from the World Equestrian Games are coming to Kentucky, and I go on this personal crusade to do something to make sure that the folks who worked, who cooked, who cleaned, who built there at my old Kentucky home, the song that people sing about, that we do not forget their presence and their story. And so we get a little closer. And as we get closer, I become even more infuriated because as I look, there's all that is there are these field stones. There are no names protruding out of the ground. But there is a monument, a little monument, and it talks about dedicated to the faithful retainers of Judge John Rowan, and it gives scripture there from Matthew 25:21. Well done, thy good and faithful servant. That's it. So I decided, I said, okay, we're going to do something. And so I immediately, and at that time I was chair of the Kentucky African American Heritage Commission. No, I was vice chair of the Kentucky African American Heritage Commission. I was later, I guess, promoted chair, whatever. But, so I met with the state parks commissioner, and I met with people here in Frankfurt, all agencies and so forth. And so the state parks commissioner said, I tell you what, Gerald, let's do this. He said, let's do an archaeological survey of those tombstones. And so we did it. Well, they did it. The Kentucky Archaeological Survey did the study. And a couple of years later, I got the study. They brought it to me. And the study revealed that there was nothing beneath those stones. Nothing. No caskets, no bones, nothing. Now, check this out. And why, and I'm going to close here out of respect, why we must dig deep. Because as a historian, the historian in me, looking to go to the facts, the historian in me decided, okay, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go and look at the newspapers for July 4th, 1945. Surely there's got to be some stories about this dedication of this cemetery, which I did. So I looked at the newspapers in Bardstown. I looked at other Kentucky newspapers to see what I could find. And sure enough, I found some newspapers, some Louisville newspapers, Louisville Courier-Journal being one, story about how, what took place, but preceding that, because not only did I focus on July 5th, because the dedication July 4th, July 5th, 6th, so I went back a little bit further to see if I could find anything happening preceding the dedication. And so what I found was that there was a front page story, a photograph that before the grounds were dedicated, that those of the who were part of the community, the mayor and others decided that they wanted to exhume one of the graves to make sure that it's a burial ground. And they exhumed one of the graves, the photos in the newspaper. And those who were gathering there, city officials and others, began to debate whether or not that was the grave of Old Black Joe. Remember, Old Black Joe was one of the songs that Stephen Collins Foster had written. And then somebody said, no, that can't be Old Black Joe's casket, because Old Black Joe, they would have had a can with money in the area. And then the mayor of Bardstown said, yeah, my cook's grandfather, used to get a lot of harmonicas. Tourists would come and give him harmonicas. And so then there's this whole discussion like, wait a minute, that's not Old Black Joe in the grave. And we should be recognizing everyone. And so, make a long story short, they had to clarify that, well, we're not saying this is Old Black Joe here. This is symbolic of everybody's here. And they dedicated the cemetery. Now, we would not have known all of that unless we had decided to dig deep into Kentucky history to find out the truth. And so I titled this latest book, which is an edited volume. It consists of 11 essays in the volume. And, one of the essays focuses on the Kentucky court system in the 1860s, how Kentucky civil courts the Kentucky Court of Appeals, that is, nullified the Civil Rights Act of 1866. But not only that, how the judicial system in Kentucky immediately following the Civil War did all it could to protect the rights of the enslavers even after the war. So we celebrate Juneteenth, but Kentucky was one of those states where the judicial system continued to support the rights of the enslavers in terms of their property rights, because understand that enslaved people were bought, sold, mortgaged, gifted. And even though slavery was over, the judicial system in Kentucky was more concerned about doing all it could to extend slavery through judicial decisions after the war. So I titled the book, and there's an article in the book, and I encourage you, you can take a look at it right here. It's out now in hardback and paperback, I might add, but and really blessed to see that. But, historian Juliana Perrone, who's done extensive research in Kentucky's judicial system, has got a wonderful chapter in the book telling that story. So I titled the book, subtitled it, Revisiting My Old Kentucky Home. And I'd subtitled it, Revisiting My Old Kentucky Home, based on my own personal experience, is that in my mind, in my memory, I had been to my old Kentucky home many times as I'd heard the song. At basketball, I'm a graduate of UK 3 times over, BA, MA, PhD. You can imagine how many times I've heard that song. Ball games and everything else, right? But going back there as a historian and learning what I did, what I implore in the introduction of the book is that it's important that we revisit my old Kentucky home, not so much to study the history of the site and the song, because another historian, Emily Bingham, has done a wonderful job, writing about the history of the song. Her book came out last year, but I use my old Kentucky home as a visual metaphor for how we study Black history in Kentucky. In other words, I wanted the book to not only dig deep in Kentucky's Black history, and the authors that I selected to be a part of this project did a wonderful job doing that. But it's important that, we bring forth the primary sources to show the truth, because otherwise we'll be dealing with a lot of myths about Kentucky's history. And many of us have been indoctrinated for years and still are being indoctrinated. What do you think this whole thing about critical race theory, 1619 Project, AP history courses? Understand this, that for years, the effort to indoctrinate, I would say effort, I say the orchestrated effort to indoctrinate everybody about not only white supremacy, but about the history has been recorded in textbooks that all of us, particularly my generation and before, read and were introduced to because we didn't know any better. Think about how many kids went to the state capitol for generations and looked at Jefferson Davis and looked at the pedestal, which recorded him as a statesman and a patriot. It's like, oh, wow. Think of how many kids Black kids in Western Kentucky, visited Jefferson Davis State Park on school trips to go to picnics. And they're on the grounds of someone who enslaved their foreparents. Why would I want to patronize somebody who has mistreated my people? So then, why is it important that we record this history? Why is it that we have Black History Month? I tell folk, it's February 28th. Whether you're a historian or not, when you're a Black person, Black History Month is every month. You know, it doesn't end for me February 28th. You know, I live it. I don't get it, you know, I don't get excited. I say, this is what I do. You know, this is what I do. I'm not working at it. This is what I do. It's who I am. So Black history is who we are, but don't miss my other point. When we do not talk about African-American history, we miss the opportunity to talk about how interrelated we are in terms of what we share, even our family history, right? Even in terms of how we worship, how we educate, how we play together. You know, what we know. I teach a course on race and sports in America. That's a whole nother subject, right? But as I close, I got to close on a positive note because I want you to know something else about Kentucky and how about revisiting. Okay, I'm already 5 minutes over, but Chief Justice said I had a little while longer, so I'm not going to take advantage of it. I'm not going to exploit that. But here's the other thing that I didn't talk about, because now I'm writing this new general history of Blacks in Kentucky. And I'm thinking, that's why I'm not accepting too many speaking engagements. I'm thinking. Because Kentucky's African-American experience is so nuanced that it's crazy. For example, real quick story. There was a book by a guy named Ben Montgomery. And Ben Montgomery's got this book where he writes about this Black man in Simpson County, Kentucky, named George Denning. All right. Now, George Denning was a man who owned his own property, had everything. He was, you know, respected in the community. He was a Black man. And on one evening in January of 1897, some white men came to take his property. He defended his property and his family and shot and killed one of them. The case goes to trial. The governor of Kentucky, Republican governor, William Bradley, pardons him, pardons the Black man. Now, not only that, George Denning then files a suit against the men who had come after his property. And a Confederate official from Kentucky, a former Confederate soldier, defends George Denning. And George becomes the first African-American to win a wrongful death decision. Now tell me, how crazy is that? Here's a Confederate soldier who says, I'm going to defend this Black man who killed a white man while defending his property. And the stories go back and forth. But you cannot deny the extent of racial violence in this state. All right, thank you. I'm going to stop right there. I'm 10 minutes over.
Oh, yeah, no, you're good. I'm about to.
I said, you want me to stop? He said, oh, you good.
No. I can listen to you for days, I tell you. Thank you, Dr. Smith. I just want to thank you again for that presentation. Once again, I could listen to you for days. That was powerful. And you inspired me to want to dig deeper into Black history. So thank you for that. Thank you. At this moment in time, I would like to transition into the presentation of the Justice William E. McAnulty Award. The Justice McAnulty Jr. Award is an award given to an individual within the Kentucky Court of Justice who has exhibited not only great excellence, but a commitment and dedication to the judicial branch of state government. It is named after the first African-American Supreme Court Justice in the state of Kentucky, Justice William E. McAnulty Jr. This award has been given to an individual within the Kentucky Court of Justice for the past 3 years. This year, it is my great pleasure to introduce the recipient of this year's award, AOC's Director of Statewide Programs, Rachel Bingham. Director Bingham oversees the Office of Statewide Programs, which includes Family and Juvenile Services, Pretrial Services, and Specialty Courts. These three statewide departments carry out statutorily required court functions in all 120 counties and collectively employ 700 court personnel. Her role also includes administering programs which provide technical assistance, training, and support services to judges, court personnel, attorneys, social workers, and community partners. Ms. Bingham is a current executive board member of the Coalition for Juvenile Justice, a board which includes experts from across the country. She is also a member of the Kentucky State Interagency Council, Kentucky Racial and Ethnic Disparities Standing Committee, National Juvenile Justice Reform and State Courts Initiative Steering Committee, National Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges Curriculum Development Committee, and the National Judicial Task Force to examine state courts' response to mental illness. Some of Rachel's notable achievements include serving as a presenter at the 2018 Janet Reno Forum, Transforming Juvenile Justice Systems Conference at Georgetown University, and the Future of Children Conference, Multi-System Approaches to Help Keep Children Out of the Justice System at Princeton University. In 2018, she became a Reducing Racial and Ethnic Disparities Certificate Program Fellow through McCourt School of Public Policy at Georgetown University. Joining us to share additional highlights of Ms. Bingham's contributions is AOC Director Lori Givens.
I want to take just a minute to thank Patrick Carrington for the phenomenal work that he has done. And I just want to encourage everybody to come back next year, because I can't imagine how he's ever going to top Dr. Smith and the presentation that you just gave us today. I think probably not just here, but that might have been one of the most engaging, significant things that I've ever heard. And I just want to thank you for spending time with us today and sharing your insight and your wisdom and your education and your passion for all of us, the citizens of the Commonwealth. And we're going to send later, I think, a link to your book for anybody who would love to purchase, because I would like to do that. And we'll look for an opportunity, perhaps, sir, to have you sign that for me sometime. I need to take just a moment to thank my friend Rachel Bingham. And everybody who knows me is probably like, the over-under on me crying is really high right now. I wouldn't take a bet that I wouldn't cry, but I'm going to try really hard to sort of separate my head for a minute from my heart so I can do this. I probably can't imagine anybody who's impacted us more just in terms of processes and things, maybe that folks don't even know are happening sometimes in our court system. In 2014, Rachel led this agency on a journey to identify not if, but how racial and ethnic disparities were affecting our court system. Her goal and mission became ours, and it was to significantly improve outcomes for minorities by institutionalizing systemic change. And I've got to draw on Dr. Smith's words in the history of maybe the Kentucky courts in 1860. That's well documented. That's first source. So when we talk about trying to institutionalize systemic and cultural change, it's not an easy task, as Rachel can tell you. But her vision and leadership led us to partner with the Office of Juvenile Justice Delinquency and Prevention, and importantly, the University of Louisville Department of Justice Administration, to create a statewide assessment report, which became our roadmap. We began offering statewide educational programs around implicit bias and cultural collision training, with Rachel bringing this first to the Department of Family and Juvenile Services as their executive officer. These have been powerful experiences for all of our employees now statewide and our elected officials. And you can imagine the mixed reactions among the folks who work in our court system to these presentations. It's important that we continue this work. It's important that we continue these presentations, and it's important that we continue the conversations, because words are difficult. As Dr. Smith pointed out, the difference between recognizing the word slave versus our need to soften perhaps sometimes the history and use the word servant. We've seen it play out nationally, and Rachel's been part of those conversations. And she's taken the work that we've done in Kentucky and used it as an example for other state courts to do nationally. And one of the words that I find most striking, I thought of the analogy, is our insistence on continuing to use the word equity instead of equality when we talk about people's treatments in a court system. Those two words don't mean the same thing. And you would be amazed at the challenge we've had trying to get people to understand the difference, the very important difference in terms of those words. Rachel remains undeterred. I've got to read something, and I'm going to try to do this. I spoke to Chief Justice Minton this morning, and he wanted me to share this message with the group because it was Chief Justice's mission, vision in supporting really Rachel's ideas. And one of the things that I want to continue to sort of stress, and just to distract myself mentally for a minute, I've got to talk about the data. I forgot to talk about the data. The data tells our story. We always have to look at the data. In 2018, we created the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Program, and we've hired Patrick Carrington. And Patrick's been helping us lead our efforts, looking at each of our statewide programs and our minority impact data in each program. It's stunning. It's stunning, the negative impacts and how much worse they are for people of color in the Commonwealth than they are for our white constituents in the court system. We're going to continue to look at our data. We're going to continue to share our data publicly. And there's so many people in this room that we have to thank. And Patrick, you are one of those. But Chief sent me this message, Rachel. And it says, equal justice under the law is the phrase engraved over the entrance to the U.S. Supreme Court building. It expresses a fundamental principle of justice. No person in modern times has done more to engrave that principle on the heart of the Kentucky Court of Justice than Rachel Bingham. I am so pleased to learn that she's the recipient of this year's McAnulty Award. There is no one more deserving. Rachel, sorry for the surprise, my dear friend. Rachel, do you want to say a couple words, or is that just a horrible position to put you in?
I'm not going to make any eye contact with anybody. I am completely humbled, honored. No words can ever express. It's a gift to do this work. And one of the biggest reasons why I'm humbled is because I'm standing here and I'm white, and I don't feel justified based upon the journey of the people that are my face before me every day. And so we do this work because people matter, and because people matter more than any other purpose. If you have been involved in any of this work, you know that we are barely tipping the numbers when it comes to disproportionality and disparity for our kids and our families and our people of color. And in my role as an administrator, I feel like it's my requirement to you to do all I can do to impact systemic racism. And that's what it is, and we should call it what it is. I would be remiss to not thank Pastor Edward Palmer, though many of you in this room know him. He helped on this journey in many ways as a mentor and a colleague, and was, really a primary person to say, to speak up and speak out. And I would also be remiss to not thank our past Chief Justice for empowering the agency and the Court of Justice to do that, as I know our current Chief Justice will continue this journey. This is our responsibility as people, as humans, and it is our responsibility to the future of our kids and families. So I literally am shaking. I am totally blown away and just want to thank you very much. And I'm honored to work for the Court of Justice and honored to be here. So thank you.
You all, as we leave here today, I just want to continue to encourage us to dig deeper, just as our keynote speaker today said. I want to thank everybody for coming, either joining us in person or virtually as well. Thank you to everybody who made this possible as well, our leadership. This is a beautiful event, and I thank you all for coming. This concludes our event today. Thank you.